We must eradicate from the soul all fear and terror of what comes out of the future. We must acquire serenity in all feelings and sensations about the future. We must look forward with absolute equanimity to anything that may come. And we must think only that whatever comes is given to us by a world direction full of wisdom. It is part of what we must learn in this age, namely, to live out of pure trust without any security in existence, trusting in the ever-present help of the spiritual world. Surely, nothing else will do if our courage is not to fail us. Let us discipline our will, and let us seek the awakening within ourselves, every morning and every evening. Okay. Hello. Those words you just heard were words given by Rudolf Steiner to his followers during World War I. And I often use those words myself as a prayer. And I maybe you'd like to do that too sometimes. I recommend it. So today we're talking about Rudolf Steiner and his relationship to Sophiology. Steiner's an interesting and underappreciated and confusing figure, for valid reasons. He was born in 1861 in what's now Croatia, but then was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was Austrian. And had an interesting biography. I mean, you don't have to know everything about him, but he seems to have developed clairvoyant abilities as born with him, actually. But when he was 7 years old or so, he had a vision of a relative who had committed suicide some miles off, and she was asking him for help. And so he kind of a natural clairvoyant. Yet he was also intellectually gifted. He went to the Realschule, the technical school, I guess you could call it, which was not the gymnasium or the college preparatory program. And so because he did that, he was preparing. He was from a poor family, working class family. His father was a railway, I don't know if he was an engineer, but he worked for the railways. And Rudolf Steiner, because he didn't go to the gymnasium, taught himself Latin and Greek. It's a very precocious intellect, but very religiously inclined. He was an altar boy, even though his father was a free thinker, and very moved by the Mass. He said, had he not gone, or had he gone to the gymnasium, he said in his autobiography, there's no doubt in his mind he would have become a Cistercian priest. But he didn't become a Cistercian priest. He became a philosopher. And he studied philosophy amongst other people, Franz Brentano. And Brentano was also the teacher of Edmund Husserl. Brentano, in a way, is one of the founders of phenomenology. And Brentano, of course, was influenced by Goethe. Brentano actually was he was a Catholic priest, but he left the priesthood when papal infallibility was proclaimed a dogma. He just couldn't deal with it anymore. Nevertheless, so for Steiner, so he becomes this philosopher, and he writes a book, a really important book, I think, called The Philosophy of Freedom. Sometimes it's called The Philosophy of Spiritual Activity, where it's really a book about thinking as a spiritual activity. Okay? What is it that happens when we think? Where do our thoughts arise from? Do they arise from phenomena? Or is there a spiritual dimension to it? And it's so not an esoteric work. It's a straight up philosophical work. Very, you have to really pay attention to it. It's written in the style of the time, the late 1800s. So he has this life. He's got like a parallel lives going. He's got this life of the intellect and German idealism, but running parallel to that is this kind of clairvoyant life, this spiritual life, and he apparently met an individual named Felix Kokoschku, who was an herb gatherer. He met him on the train when he would on his way to school, and he became friends with this person, and he learned a lot about the natural world through this man, and he actually, since he lived for part of his life at least close to the peasantry, he learned a lot about nature through them and through their folk wisdom. This is around the time that the Brothers Grimm were gathering their folk tales, so there was, at least in the culture and in Steiner in particular, a deep appreciation for folk wisdom, folk practices. He didn't dismiss them, you know. He didn't have what E.P. Thompson has called the enormous condescension of posterity toward those things that went before. And so Steiner gets in touch with this herb gatherer, and I think, you know, no one really knows, but through some pathways he also drew on what we could call the Rosicrucian impulse, that, and I don't mean necessarily the Freemasonic Rosicrucian impulse. I do mean the impulse that we saw in Vaughan and Flood, that idea that nature has a spiritual dimension to it, and that the artistic element to investigation of nature, which also comes from Goethe. And interestingly enough, the Weimar edition of Goethe's collected works, Steiner, as a young scholar, was hired to edit the scientific works. And it might sound like a big deal, and it was a big deal for a young scholar, but they kind of gave it to the new guy, because at the time Goethe's scientific works were not considered all that important. But here's Steiner, right? It's kind of it's fate, in a sense. He edits these works and draws him even more deeply into Goethe's mind and his methodology, this methodology of reverence, which really will come in with Steiner when he develops Waldorf education, for instance. Reverence is an important component of that education. So that's where Steiner was as a young man. But then, you know, he really couldn't find a regular academic position. So he would teach classes at working men's places or different situations, you know, kind of like teaching like an adjunct nowadays. But around this time, there was also the rise of Madame Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society. Now, that theosophy is very different from the theosophy that was taught by Burma, for instance. Blavatsky's theosophy, if you don't know about it, is very influenced by Hinduism and Buddhism, and there is also a little bit of spiritualism, you know, the table tapping and what have you, that was part of that milieu. Now, so Steiner, though, here's an academic who's a trained philosopher, but also has this clairvoyant side, and so he's wondering, you know, when should I say what I really have to say? And there's a really interesting documentary, if you want to check it out, called "The Challenge of Rudolf Steiner," and that's kind of the recurring theme there. How long must I be silent? And it was, and basically Steiner was silent till he was about 40 years old, when he became the secretary of the German section of the Theosophical Society in Germany, and started giving lectures, and he gave lots of lectures. Apparently he was a profoundly moving speaker, captivating. You know, he had a very sonorous and deep voice and really drew people in and inspired them. He was also really funny, which you might not get from his lectures. Most of his lectures are just from unedited transcriptions by a stenographer, and very often his jokes were edited out. Though if you do look at Steiner's lectures on agriculture or beekeeping, a lot of his jokes in there were kept in those, and you can see his kind of wry sense of humor, which is a wonderful thing to see. Apparently, I heard a story years and years ago that David Spangler, the kind of New Age philosopher, was interested in Steiner, and he would look for people who had known Rudolf Steiner sometime in history, and he went to every one of these people he could find. They were all really old at the time, and they all told a very different story about who he was, but they had one thing in common. They would all say, boy, was he funny. He had a great sense of humor. And you might not get that impression. So anyway, so here's Steiner hanging out with the Theosophists, and he adopted their language, right? One of the prevailing ideas in Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine is this idea of pralaya and manvantara, which he takes from Hinduism, where all of the cosmos goes through a series of death and rebirth, not just individuals, but the cosmos as well. And Steiner adopted this and changed it and used his own insights. And his book Cult Science, for instance, is about this. But Steiner, so this is in the beginning of his career. He speaks like a Theosophist because he's hanging out with the Theosophists. But gradually, though, he changes. Because gradually Christianity, and in fact Christ himself, becomes so important to Steiner as he understands this mystery more and more, that he really feels compelled to break with the Theosophists, and that's when he starts the Anthroposophical Society, the Wisdom of Man. Pardon me. And now, interestingly enough, anthroposophists and any group following a kind of guru or spiritual teacher, they're afraid to admit that a person changes over time. If you read Steiner's early lectures, they're so full of theosophical jargon and references to masters, for instance, like Blavatsky claimed to receive her information from these masters in Tibet who would transmit them psychically to her. And Steiner talked the same language, right? But if you see it over the course of his career, that language falls to the wayside. It just drops, and he changes, and he becomes more. I mean, he's absolutely a Christian. I mean, he's a very esoteric Christian. Has a very different take on Christianity than most orthodox streams of Christianity. But you can't call him anything else but a Christian. And here's what he said about it in his autobiography. During the period when my statements about Christianity so contradicted my later ones in literal content, a conscious knowledge of true Christianity began to dawn within me. Around the turn of the century, this knowledge grew deeper. This experience culminated in my standing spiritually in the presence of the mystery of Golgotha, in a most inward, profound, and solemn festival of knowledge. So here's Steiner, he's this profound festival of knowledge. He realizes that at the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, it was not only the redemption of man, it was the redemption of everything. The earth itself was deadening, and when Christ, this is according to Steiner's thought, and then when the precious blood hit the earth at the crucifixion, it regenerated the earth. And actually, this is an insight later that Sergei Bulgakov came to in his book on the Holy Grail. So yeah, so it's not unique to Steiner, and I think this is a profound insight. A profound insight. So that's his relationship to Christianity, and it increased as he grew older. Now, Steiner is really an incredibly intelligent, multifaceted person. But what happened, he did speak about Sophia in some of his lectures, and unfortunately, most of the time Steiner speaks about Sophia directly, it seems like warmed over Gnostic myth where Sophia is in hiding, she's been taken away by Lucifer, all this kind of stuff. And, it's kind of unsatisfactory. There's a compendium of his lectures on Sophia that Christopher Bamford put out through the Anthroposophical Press called Isis, Mary, Sophia, I think it's called. But you can see there, they're not terrible, but it's just not as original as you might hope. Kind of disappointing in a way. But there is another way that Steiner does Sophiology. And this way is through his more practical initiatives, we could call them. I don't think the guy ever turned anybody down. People would ask him, could come over and give lectures about this or that, and he would always say yes. So here's this guy traveling all over Europe and trains at night and meeting with, who knows, 5, 10 people, maybe more, and giving a lecture on whatever they inquired. But what happened with World War I, Steiner saw the face of darkness and thought, wow, what could happen to humanity if something is, culture is not regenerated now. We have to regenerate culture, including the sciences. He talked lots about the sciences, and his thought was that the sciences needed to go through materialism as an evolutionary step out. He never let go of that theosophical understanding of involution and evolution. But he thought the sciences needed to go through that period of darkness in which we now find it, in order to later come to the spirit in a new way that was not atavistic, that was not somnambulant. It was very full of consciousness of the spiritual world. And this, certainly his reading of Goethe had something to do with this, but there was more to it than that. Like I said, and also the Rosicrucian element as well. But he was ever optimistic. He's always positive about things. Now, so here's Europe is disintegrating. World War I. You can imagine what people felt like, and people were coming to Rudolf Steiner saying, "Dr. Steiner, can you do something for us?" And one person in particular who came to him was Emil Molt, who was the owner of the Waldorf cigarette factory in Stuttgart. And he went to Dr. Steiner and said, "Can you create some kind of education for the workers for the children of my workers, that this won't have to happen again? That this devastation we see all around us, can we build a new culture? Can you do this?" And Steiner said, "Okay." And it's really miraculous. He picked some people he knew to be the teachers. And he would pick Walter Johannes Stein was one of the teachers, and I think Stein's I can remember I think he was trained as a physicist, but Steiner said you could teach history, because he didn't want people with the expertise in something to teach it because they think they know it already. And and I know this from having been a Waldorf teacher, that part of the thrill of teaching is as you're learning something, you're seeing it with new eyes, and you can bring that to the children, and your enthusiasm for what you've discovered is what carries you. If I had to teach, I wonder how I'd be as an English teacher or a philosophy teacher in a Waldorf school. I'm afraid I'd think I'd know everything. So anyway, so Steiner takes Emil Molt up on his offer, and he picks several teachers, and he gives a 2-week lecture course. There's 3 lectures a day, and then the school starts. And those courses are available. One's the study of man, I don't know what they call it now, is one of them. Discussions with teachers, and the other one I can't remember right now. But when I became a Waldorf teacher, I read these in the sequence that they were delivered, hoping that I could in 2 weeks become a Waldorf teacher. It took a little longer than that. But anyway, so this is one example. And in Waldorf education, Steiner includes the arts in every subject. Everything is taught artistically. Children don't have textbooks, they make their books, and it's something that's a product of an extraordinary environment. And I don't want to get into the whole thing, but it's very sophiological. It's a disclosure of the beauty of the universe. You teach these children in reverence. And I've seen firsthand when children are taught in this way, not only does it preserve their childhood a little bit, preserve their innocence, but it opens them to wonder. And you don't see in Waldorf schools as much as you do in, say, public school or even Catholic school, the cynicism that often infects the young. Because everything's done with reverence, and there's a spirit of joy in this education. So that's one example of Steiner's sophiological approach to things. I mean, this is true sophiology, right? And not only do the arts are they part of education, but also handwork. You know, children learn how to knit, how to sew. All boys and girls. They learn gardening. They learn woodworking. You know, all these practical skills in addition to the academic skills. And what does that do? It makes for a well-rounded human being who's not afraid of the world. So another examples that's with Steiner, people ask him for help, right? Count Kaiserlink, who was a philosopher at the time, he had a big estate in what's now Poland, and asked Dr. Steiner to come and give some lectures on agriculture. And so Steiner goes there, gives these lectures, and essentially he's the founder of, well, he and Mr. Rodale from the United States, he becomes the founder of organic agriculture, which in his iteration is called biodynamic agriculture, because he brought into agriculture a lot of those peasant wisdom things we talked about. But he didn't just, it wasn't like a throwback. He was bringing it in and bringing it with a new kind of way of seeing. And as we talked a couple lectures ago, with these ideas of the biodynamic preparations, for instance, you know, if you're putting crystal quartz, powdered crystal quartz into a cow horn and burying it over the summer in the earth, or you're burying cow manure in a cow horn over the winter and potentizing them by cosmic forces, he would say, right? Now, it sounds crazy, right? But think about this. I think it's a very easy thought experiment. Do you think those substances, whether it's crystal quartz or cow manure, you think they would be any different after 6 months had they spent their time in a plastic cow horn? The answer is yes. It's a different substance. And the other thing with Steiner is he didn't want people to just take his word for it. And he often, all the way through these lectures, he says, go try it for yourself. We'll have to think different ways, but what's important is you try it. And it is important that you try it and see if it works. He doesn't want you to take it on faith. And again, that's a very sophiological approach to things. So likewise, as people talk to Steiner about the arts, he brought new impulses to the arts with eurythmy, which is a kind of interpretive movement. He also brought some former Lutheran pastors came to him asking him what he could do for religion, and he came up with a service for what's now called the Christian community. Some physicians came to him and said, "Hey, Dr. Steiner, can you help us?" And he brought insights into them for working with the sick and the dying, and introducing different kinds of medicines. And he did all this stuff. I don't know where it all came from. And it's been growing. And it's also he drew a lot on homeopathy in his recommendations for medicine, because the idea in homeopathy and in Steiner's medicine is, so take, say, mandrake. In fact, I used to be a landscaper when I was a Waldorf teacher. I had a landscaping business in the summer, and I ruined my right rotator cuff from chiseling with a spade, chopping tree roots, and it was super painful, and I didn't want to have surgery. And I was going to an anthroposophical doctor at the time, and he gave me some shots that my wife had to administer because I can't reach behind my back, and they were shots of mandragora root, a remedy made from mandragora root, and it was helping, but it wasn't helping a lot. And then so I went to him after my checkup. I said, "Well, it hasn't totally gone away. It's still there." And he gave me, I don't know if it's 2 or 3 shots right then, and it hasn't come back. So I'm a believer. Now, so people just came to him, and he would come up with these insights for this. Now, what I was going to say about homeopathy and with Steiner's medicines, the idea is that, so if you have mandrake root, well, you don't just stick a mandrake root on my shoulder. You potentize it, and what you try to do in homeopathy is reduce the physical substance of whatever the thing is, mandrake root, to its smallest possible part. Now, this goes back to the alchemists, whether they're burning it or pulverizing it or however they're doing it. You reduce it to the smallest part, because the smallest potency you can get it to, the spiritual part of the substance becomes greater, and that's where the healing happens. It brings these forces, forces connected to the cosmos, into that medicine. At least that's the idea, and it seems to work. So, yeah, all these people came to Steiner for help in their different disciplines, and he did, and you have to thank a person like this for his initiatives. Now, let's talk about the enormous condescension of posterity. Now, it's really difficult for Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants, to read Steiner and not get freaked out. For good reason. A lot of the things he says are really weird to Christians. He talks a lot about reincarnation. That's one thing that never left his language or the course of his career, is his understanding of karma and reincarnation. Now, do you have to accept everything he says lock, stock, and barrel? I don't think so. I mean, people do. But I don't think you need to. I think, and he wouldn't want you to. He would say, see if it works. And if it doesn't work, don't worry about it. And he'd probably also add a joke to it. Now, in closing, I guess we'll say that, there's a lot that Rudolf Steiner still has to offer to the world in his sophiological intuitions about how we can do things here that allow the splendor of the splendor of God, the glory of the Lord, Sophia, to shine through. Now he does it through all of these practical initiatives he had. I think and I hope that over the course of time, those things will infiltrate, Western culture, every culture, much in the way as an antidote to the kind of dreadful things that have infiltrated Western culture through bad philosophy, like through the philosophy of Judith Butler, or badly applied deconstruction. I like Jacques Derrida quite a bit, but there's a lot of Bush League deconstructionists out there who need to put the pencil down. But Steiner really offered a lot to us, and I think it's important that if you read Steiner, that you accept it as, read him in sophiologically, read him agapeically, right? Just listen to him. You don't have to judge him. You don't have to say, well, I can't believe this because my church says. You don't have to do any of that. You just attend. Now, where this started for me, with Rudolf Steiner, is I was interested, I don't know how I got this idea in my head about Rosicrucians. I want to know, I read about it in a book someplace. And I wanted to find out what they were. And so I bought this book at this bookstore, this occult bookstore, what's called Rosicrucian Esotericism, I think it was called. And I read it, and it had almost nothing to do with the Rosicrucians, at least how I was thinking about it. So I was kind of disappointed. And Steiner's hard to read anyway. But then I found this book called Cosmic and Human Metamorphoses. And in there, in one of the lecture, maybe the first or second lecture, he talks about these 3 meetings. The first meeting, he says, is with the father principle. And he says this father principle meeting happens over the course of a person's life, but usually not before a person turns 28 years old. If you know anything about astrology, that's the cycle of Saturn, 28, 29 years old. It takes Saturn that long to go all the way, because then you're a grown-up. Remember, don't trust anyone over 30. And so you encounter the father principle, he says through there. Which, okay, but when he talked about the other 2 principles, the other 2 meetings, here's when he really got me. The second meeting he talked about was the encounter with the principle of the sun. And he said this happens through the course of a year if we pay attention to the subtle changes in nature, in plants. Maybe so you're paying attention to what happens in nature. And actually, I doubt that I would have become a farmer had I not started this. And I said, well, if that's going to let you meet Christ, I'm joining. So I started doing that. I started paying attention to the subtle changes day by day over the course of a year. And it was hard at first because, I was living in the city. Not an easy thing to do, but this is something I always kind of fall back to trying to pay attention to. And this is really a contemplative way of living. If you're really, right now I'm looking out the window, and it's mid-September, and really, the flora and fauna right now is so different than it was a month ago, and it's so different than it was a week ago. It's so different from what it was yesterday. And so, now how does this become our encounter with Christ over the course of the year? Probably through the death and resurrection of nature. Right? Easter becomes such. I've always paid attention to where the moon is at Easter. I've been watching. The moon kind of turns this way, like a chalice, and fills up with light by the time of Easter, and through the latter part of Lent. I always tell my children it's the Grail moon. It's the Holy Grail filling up. And then the third principle that Steiner talks about is the principle with the spirit. Or he could also says the divine within you, or the Holy Spirit. You could say, and he said, well, this happens every night through the course of sleep. You meet the Spirit, and we don't recall it. And maybe it filters through in dreams sometimes, but we don't recall it. But this rhythm, and it's why rhythm for him is an important thing. Principle in Waldorf education is rhythm replaces strength. So if a child is not good at mathematics, right, or getting reading, what's not important is trying to cram it all in, but what's important is keep it rhythmic. So every day you do 5 or 10 minutes of mental math, and rather than twice a week do 40 minutes of worksheets. You'd be surprised at how efficient this method is for teaching. So rhythm replaces strength. So you apply that same principle that you would use in teaching children to your own spiritual life. Rhythm replaces strength. So the rhythm of a lifetime of 28 years, 28, 56. The rhythm of the year, the cosmic cycle of the year. I mean, I think there's tremendous wisdom, and Steiner emphasized this, tremendous wisdom in the church's cycle of the festivals, at least how it used to be, and the agricultural year, to see how the spiritual and the physical are intimately connected. That's nothing but Sophiology right there. And also, with rhythm replaces strength. Just another thing we always emphasize as a Waldorf teacher is regular bedtime, right, for the children. Get enough sleep, because they have to have time to enter into the spiritual world and come back refreshed. Same with us. Don't go to bed drunk, right? Don't have erratic bedtimes, because rhythm replaces strength. All right. So it's probably a good place to stop. And I will, I guess, to end, I would say that in the Submerged Reality, for instance, I include Steiner in the chapter on Romanticism. And that's because Owen Barfield, who was one of the Inklings, but also an anthroposophist, he thought of Steiner's teaching as Romanticism all grown up, his exact words. Because all those promises that Romanticism made and couldn't quite keep, we talked about that last time with the noble failure of Romanticism. Now, Barfield sees them fulfilled in Steiner. And I see them potentially fulfilled. I mean, I think Steiner was definitely on the road. I think we still have some ways to go. And I also think, it's probably controversial to say, that for Steiner's work to be taken to the next step, it cannot be left to the Anthroposophical Society. Because, like with any group, poor Rudolf Steiner, he's been dogmatized by the Anthroposophical Society, and even by Waldorf education to a degree. Even biodynamic agriculture, they want to turn it into a doctrine, you know what I mean? And he didn't want that. So I think for his work to be taken up, he'll have to go elsewhere. So I always joke to my friend, Therese Schroeder-Shaker, I say, well, if the anthropops aren't going to use Steiner, let's take them back. So that's probably a good place to stop. And I will. Here's a good way to end. I'm going to read you. I used to say this. Every Waldorf teacher does say this. At the end, at the beginning of the school day, from grades 5 through 12. This is how the child begins the day. It's a wonderful way to begin. I look into the world, wherein there shines the sun, wherein there gleam the stars, wherein there lie the stones, wherein the plants do live and grow, the beasts do feel and move, and man to spirit gives a dwelling in his soul. I look into the soul that lives and moves in me. God's spirit lives and weaves, in light of sun and soul, in heights of world without, in depths of soul within. To Thee, O Spirit of God, I turn myself in prayer, that strength and grace and skill for learning and for work may live and grow in me. And may it live and grow in all of us. See you next time.